Everyone, this is Sam, Global Head of Search at Pod Talent. Today I'm joined by Sami Naffakh. Sami has experience in leadership roles across a variety of consumer goods businesses, including Unilever, Danone, Estee Lauder, and Arla Foods, and most recently was the Chief Supply Officer of Reckitt. Sami, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
First things first, could you just tell me a little bit about yourself and your career journey so far?
I'm Sami Naffakh. I studied engineering, got a master, and then quickly got into work. So I started with Unilever, where I stayed for about 10 years. A pretty classic career path. Started as a project engineer, went up to operations, led a factory, and ended up building a greenfield operation in North Africa, which was probably the highlight of my journey with Unilever. Then left Unilever to go to Reckitt the first time. I did various roles, some of them corporate, some of them more operational. Did that for about 6 years, and then moved to Danone, which was my first real senior role, where I first led a pretty large size manufacturing operation in Europe, the Middle East, and Latin America, and then moved to Singapore to lead the end-to-end operations of baby nutrition in that region. Then moved to Estee Lauder, as you said, similar role, different region, end-to-end supply chain, but this time in Europe, Middle East, and Africa. To then move to Arla Foods, which was my first role as Chief Supply Chain Officer. Stayed there for a couple of years before joining Reckitt in the same role, probably slightly bigger size, up to recently. So that was my career journey in a very, very nutshell.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. In terms of your career, Sami, could you tell me throughout your career, what was the most important advice that you received personally from mentors?
I think I would say I know you asked for one, but I would say two actually. One was that build the foundation of skills and competencies. So before trying to go vertically, build a pretty wide and robust kind of foundation of expertise across a variety of fields. So, diversify the roles in terms of functions, in terms of geographies, in terms of categories, etc. So that would be one. The second one is a career is always a combination of performance and luck. So the second advice, which I found very useful, is know how to recognize the right move to make, because it's good to have luck, but you need to be able to identify when there is a luck to be seized. So that would be the second one.
I'm curious, as a headhunter, that's something that I talk about a lot in terms of what is the right move to make and what is the right opportunity. How do you identify that, and how do you sort of evaluate that, as you say, when you're looking at whether it's internally at the next opportunity or diversifying regions or moving externally? How have you done that through your career?
Well, I don't have a magic formula for that, but so there's always a bit of a gut feeling is what I'm trying to say here. But the way I looked at it, so for example, when I decided to give it a go and to go in North Africa and Algeria, where nobody wanted to go for Unilever, the risk was pretty high, the support was pretty low, but the return for that risk was immense, right? Because at that age, I was like 31, 32, being given the chance of building an entire greenfield operation, including a new factory, a new distribution network, setting up a procurement chain. That was pretty unique, right? So how much risk and how much am I going to be pushed outside of my comfort zone and my skill sets, versus how much can I learn from that and how much return can I have in terms of personal growth and professional growth, would be the way I would look at it. And it's like an investment, a financial investment. Low risk, low return, high risk, high return. What doesn't work is when you have high risk, low return. But if and even if it doesn't work, that's always the way I look at it. If it's a high risk, it doesn't work out, but it will have been an experience which will have contributed to your growth and your learning experience. It's still worth it.
You mentioned your experience working in Singapore, your experience working in Algeria. How much do you credit working in different regions and different geographies to eventually reaching that COO, CSCO level?
Hugely. I think it's, it of course all depends on how you see your journey and whether you want to have a journey in a big corporation, etc. But if you wanna have a career growth in the multinational, you need to have a decent understanding of how people work in different regions, right? It's a question of how people communicate, what triggers them, how do you build business relationships internally, but also externally with customers, with suppliers. And you're mentioning Singapore. Actually, Asia is within Asia. There's some huge differences, right? Between Southeast Asia and Japan and Korea and China is going to be completely different. Between Asia as a whole and Europe and Latin America, there is some huge differences. You need to understand these, otherwise you risk getting in the trap of seeing things through the angle you've always seen them, or you've always been customized to, which might lead you into trouble. And look, that's on the professional side. On the personal side, from a personal development, it's also, it gives you a view on things and a view on the world, which I think is much wider, right? Because you understand that there is some very different perspectives on the same events, which is difficult. It's conceptually, but to live it makes it completely different.
No, amazing. I agree. And I think having spent time out in Asia myself and worked in roles where I'm speaking to people across Asia, until you're there, it's quite hard to realize how different culturally each country, each region is. And I can imagine once you're in a global role, overseeing teams in all of them, having that hands-on experience can be incredibly helpful. Sami, in terms of supply chain, I think we all know supply chain's evolving very, very quickly. There's a lot of upcoming new skills, new technologies. What do you think are the most important skills that supply chain leaders of the future must develop and must start beginning to develop now to be a chief supply chain officer in 5, 10, 15 years?
Look, it's an interesting question. So of course, you need to understand the basics of each of the constituents of supply chain, right? So you need to be proficient in planning and manufacturing, logistics, and procurement. At least, if you want to be leading an end-to-end supply chain, you need to have had experience in a number of these. Maybe not all of them, that's ideal, but in a number of these. But to your point, things are moving very fast. So on top of having this kind of proficiency in the various fields, there are three things that I would point out as being paramount. One is we're in a very volatile and shaky geopolitical environment, and geopolitics have a direct impact on supply chains. Whether you think about the logistics flows, whether you think about your sourcing footprints, it has a direct impact. So being able to understand what's going on at this geopolitical level and relate it to what consequences it can have on your supply chain because of the way it's being set up, and therefore what needs to be worked on today, because changing a footprint takes years. So understanding what's coming, what might be an impact, and therefore what might be a mitigation to this impact is paramount. So that would be number one. Number two, as you said, technology is moving very fast, and we know that it's going to be impacting supply chain as everywhere, right? And of course, this is AI, and this is the quantum computing, and you name it. More and more, you need to understand this, because more and more, the way I look at things is that a lot of what was done manually or semi-manually is going to be done automatically. So look at planning, for example. More and more, the overall planning, balancing between your constrained supply and your end constrained demand and the trade-offs in the inventory. You can imagine that AI is going to be running this more or less fully. But you need to understand how it works, and you need to understand whether it's going right in the right direction or the wrong direction, so that you can correct it before it goes completely wrong. And to do this, you need to understand not only the fundamentals of planning, and you can apply the same to all the other fields, but you need to understand how the AI algorithm works. And therefore, you need to be able to assess whether the output you get is sensible or not. It's a bit like, flying a plane when the role of a pilot became not to fly the plane, but to monitor that everything is going all right. And he's got all these, displays to help him understanding whether things are going right or not. That's the same kind of move that I would see. So that would be number two. Number three is more and more ESG is paramount in the way you run your supply chain. This is not just the environment. Of course, it's the environment, but it's not just the CO2 footprint. It's also the biodiversity. It's also the use of plastic. And then when it comes to ESG, it's also about, creating or giving a sustainable living to people throughout your supply chain ecosystem. And this is not just your immediate suppliers. This is the suppliers of the suppliers and the farmers. If you're buying agricultural commodities, you need to understand how this works, and you need to be sensitive to it, because more and more is going to be a license to operate. So more and more, and by the way, I think it's a great thing, but more and more, you won't be able to operate the supply chain if you don't operate in a sustainable and a socially responsible way. And to do so, you need to understand what that means, and you need to understand how you ensure that throughout your supply ecosystem, not just your supply chain, but your supply ecosystem, things are under control.
I think it's a really good answer. I think in particular, a lot of people today are talking about AI, they're talking about machine learning, they're talking about all these new technologies that they're implementing, but it does feel anecdotally, when I'm speaking with people about what the priorities are within their team, sustainability has started to take less of a picture than it did maybe 3-4 years ago. And I think it's so important that, for a start with the AI and the development of that, people need to understand that, because it's developing so quickly. I feel like sometimes it might even be outstripping the people who are running it. And secondly, that ESG focus has to be maintained. And it does feel like, those skill sets are ones that are in high demand. People are certainly looking to recruit for them, but they're in low supply, and I don't know how much people are focusing on them. So it's really interesting getting your perspective on that.
Yeah, look, and you're absolutely right. I'm not sure that people and companies and corporations are doing less on ESG, but for sure it's less of the, agenda or communication that it was or it has been in some years. But I still think that most organizations and companies know that it's going to be licensed to operate sooner rather than later, be it because of regulations. There's new regulations coming in the UK. There's the Green Deal in Europe. Be it because of the scarcity of materials. So you're going to have to be operating in a more sustainable way. And that even if it hits you in 30 years from now, you need to start working on it now. But you're right. It's a topic. I think, what you're describing, that, things seem to be shifting quite quickly, is a reflection of another thing that is more and more paramount. And by the way, that's the case in supply chain, but that's the case across all the functions in the companies now, which is that you need to juggle all the time between the short-term imperatives. And because you have a lot of volatility and a lot of uncertainty and a lot of unpredictability, you are hit by many more short-term unexpected events than maybe you used to. So you need to be able to balance that short-term focus with the longer-term strategic focus, which is all about, okay, how do I cope with the technological revolution? How do I make sure that I've got an ESG responsible supply chain, etc., etc. And that's the struggle, right? Because of course the short term kind of pulls you all the time away from these big, longer term strategic topics, which is something that, frankly, I think everybody's struggling with, and everybody needs to develop a better ability to be able to balance.
I'm curious, on ESG in particular, what do you think is the best way for people to develop those skills? Is this academic? Is this by bringing in external people, or bringing in even internal sustainability teams to work with them on their supply chains? What is the best way to develop that skill set?
I would say a combination of everything, right? It's good to have a proper theoretical understanding of what is the ESG and what's behind, the various pillars of the United Nations ESG framework, etc., etc. but it's equally good to be able to understand how this relates practically with the operation you have to deal with, right? So if I'm talking sustainable living, what does it mean for me? How do I look at this, right? And how do I look at this? By the way, this is also where you need to understand that people need to look at this, especially in supply chain, beyond the boundaries of their companies and beyond the boundaries of their primary supply, because usually the issues are much deeper in the supply ecosystem. But it is still your brands and it is still your company, and you're still, people need to understand that you're still going to be held accountable and liable if there is some issues. So you need to understand this, and to do so, of course, usually you do have some internal specialized resources, but NGO can also help you. So, for example, in my previous roles, we worked with a lot of NGOs when it came to sustainable living, when it came to responsible farming, when it came to the protection of biodiversity. Typically, Reckitt is buying a fair amount of palm oil, which is pretty controversial from a biodiversity standpoint. So also working with NGOs who are on the field, who know the situation and the local context, to help to educate you and to help you driving improvements.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much. Sami, in terms of advice that you would give to people, firstly, if you were to mentor or speak to a senior director or a vice president that is aspiring to become a chief supply chain officer, what advice would you give to that person?
Look, I would, at that level, I would advise the person to check whether he or she believes he or she's got a robust foundation, or whether they're missing something. Sometimes what I'm trying to say here is that sometimes it's better to take a lateral move before going up than going up too quickly and then figuring out that you have big pieces missing, and therefore that is very difficult for you to be able to deliver upon your work. That would be one. I would really. It's all about, those positions are about leading organizations and people, and large organizations and people. So that would be a second question, right? How comfortable do you feel with this, and if there are some gaps, how do you address those gaps, and either through assignments or through coaching, etc., etc. But you've got to be able to drive large organizations, which means you've got to be able to set, and not only set, that convey and share a very clear direction. And you've got to be able to engage an organization behind what you're trying to achieve and direction where you go, which sounds easy, but it's absolutely not easy. It's actually very, very difficult, just because of the diversity of organization you have, etc., etc. So that would be a second one. And the third one would be a bit what I referred to, which is, in those senior roles, you really have to be able to balance your immediate operational imperatives and your strategic agenda. And how well you're going to be doing this is going to set the pace for the rest of your organization. So how much are you able to combine those two? And how do you do it, right? Whether in terms of time management, in terms of priority management, in terms of being, having enough bandwidth to be able to listen to understand what's going on beyond your organization, so that you can determine path and trends. That would be a third one, and of course the last one. But I think this is true for at any kind of level. It's all about collaboration, right? And typically, when you're in supply chain, you don't have an objective for yourself, right? You're here to serve. You're here to serve your colleagues. So typically, you're here to make sure that your consumers and new customers are going to get the product on time, in full, at the right quality, and that's for your business colleagues and for your finance colleagues, with the right profitability and the right working capital. So it's all about working together. So it's also something, how able are you to effectively collaborate, including with people who, by definition, will have different agendas, different views on things, different perspective. one should not be naive. There are better teams than others. There are more cohesive teams than others. But the naive view that everybody is in a happy mood and everybody's got the same agenda and the same views on things and everybody's going in the right direction is, at least in my experience, very rarely happening. And people need to be able to navigate within this. Without, of course, if it's becoming toxic, it's a different topic. But politics and diverging views and diverging pulls and push is a normal thing in a large organization, and people need to be able to deal with that.
And I imagine that's a skill set that you do get exposed to earlier on in your career, but the more senior you get, the more common that becomes. And it's a really interesting point that you make. But yeah.
And you're right. You're getting exposed to this pretty quickly in your career. The difference is the more senior the more senior you get, the less and the least you can hide behind somebody else, right? There is no boss for you to, hide behind. Might be a bit strong, but at least share your frustration, your anxiety, and who you expect to help you with this kind of struggle. When you're a senior, nobody's going to help you because you're supposed to be able to deal with this effectively by yourself. And you're supposed to be helping others dealing with it effectively also.
No, amazing. On the other side of the coin, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting out their career in supply chain?
Look, as I said before, use the initial years of your career to build a strong foundation of skills and competencies. Don't try to go too fast, too high, because that's one of the learnings I had in my very old time at Unilever. But they had this picture of you need to build a pyramid, not a column, because the more the column goes high, the more unstable it is, which is I think a pretty decent picture. So you want to build a pyramid, which means that the early stage, at the lowest stage of the pyramid, the base has to be very wide, and then it's gonna reduce. It's gonna reduce over time. So I would really encourage people to do this, and that means a variety of environments, a variety of geographies. Working between operational and corporate roles, working in different functions or sub functions of supply chain, even going outside of supply chain to come back. Right. So typically, having some experience in sales might be useful, because then when you're talking about customer service and serving your customers in the future with salespeople, you might understand a bit more where they come from. And then look, I would, but that's not just for supply people. Having fun, I think, is you need to enjoy what you're doing. It's difficult to be doing a good job if you're not enjoying what you're doing. So making sure that you are having fun in what you're doing, in how you're doing it, in the team that you're a member of. If you feel that you're not in the right environment or not in the right job, I would say you need to quickly think about how you move away from that, because it's painful for you, it's painful for your colleagues or stakeholders, and it very rarely ends up well. So cut it short quickly to make it in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Sami, thank you so much. Some really, really great advice there. Really appreciate you taking the time.
No, look, thank you very much for interviewing me, and it's been a very pleasant conversation, Sam. Thanks a lot.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right.